The temperature outside Henrik Larsson's half-buried metal shelter had dropped to 43 degrees below zero, and three trappers who'd mocked his tin cave for 6 months now stood at his recessed doorway, shivering and desperate. What they discovered inside would change how every man in the northern Rockies thought about surviving winter. Before we begin, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories like this resonate with you, hit that subscribe button because tomorrow's tale is even more remarkable. Henrik Larsson's reputation in the trapping community shifted from competent Swede to addled fool on the morning he arrived at his chosen home site with 4 massive sheets of corrugated iron strapped to pack mules. The metal had cost him an entire season's worth of beaver pelts purchased from a trading post that had salvaged the material from an abandoned stamp mill operation 30 miles south. Other trappers watched him unload with expressions ranging from confusion to outright mockery. The year was 1841. The Rocky Mountain fur trade was entering its final profitable decade, and men still risked everything for beaver pelts that commanded premium prices in eastern markets. Henrik had survived 4 winters in these mountains, trapping the tributaries that fed into the Yellowstone River. He was known as careful, competent, and remarkably successful at avoiding the accidents and encounters that killed trappers with brutal regularity. That reputation died the moment he unloaded corrugated metal instead of trapping supplies. Thomas Webb, a grizzled trapper who'd spent 7 years in the mountains, rode past Henrik's pack train that morning and stopped to stare. The metal sheets caught sunlight, flashing like mirrors against the pine forest backdrop. Each panel measured roughly 8 feet long and 4 feet wide, corrugated in waves that gave the material structural rigidity. The metal was salvaged industrial material, originally used in mining operations to protect equipment from weather and rockfall. Webb approached Henrik's camp and examined the metal with undisguised skepticism. "What in God's name are you planning to do with that?" he asked. Henrik looked up from securing his mules. His English carried the thick accent of someone who'd learned the language as an adult, each word carefully pronounced. "I build my home for winter," he said simply. Webb laughed. It wasn't a polite chuckle, but a full-throated bark of disbelief. "You spent a year's earnings on metal sheets? Boy, you built a cabin with logs and an axe. That metal won't keep you warm, won't keep out wind, won't do anything but make you the poorest trapper in the territory." Henrik didn't argue. He simply nodded and returned to his work, methodically unstrapping the metal panels and stacking them carefully against a tree. His silence only reinforced Webb's certainty that the Swede had lost his mind. By evening, word had spread through the scattered trapping community. Henrik Larsson had bought metal instead of supplies. Henrik Larsson was planning to build something with industrial salvage. Henrik Larsson, who'd seemed so sensible for 4 years, had apparently cracked under the isolation and hardship that broke many men in these mountains. The mockery had begun, and it would only intensify as Henrik's true plans became visible. While other trappers built on flat ground near water sources, Henrik selected a south-facing hillside 200 yards from the nearest creek. The slope would make hauling water difficult. The elevation would expose him to wind. The location had no timber close enough for convenient firewood gathering. Every experienced mountain man knew you built near resources. Henrik knew this too, yet he deliberately chose the worst possible site. Thomas Webb returned 3 days after the metal incident and found Henrik surveying the hillside with a measuring rope. Webb shook his head in disbelief. "You're building up there? That's the most foolish location I've seen in 7 years." Henrik walked the slope, examining the angle and southern exposure with careful attention. "This hillside gets sun all winter," he said. "Ground does not freeze as deep here." Webb spat tobacco juice and gestured toward the creek below. "And you'll haul every bucket of water uphill. You'll carry every load of firewood twice as far. You'll be exposed to every wind that comes through this valley." He paused, studying Henrik's face for some sign of understanding. "There's flat ground right beside the creek. Build there like a sensible man." But Henrik had already made his decision. He'd spent the previous winter watching how different locations weathered the cold. He'd noticed that south-facing slopes shed snow faster, received more direct sunlight, and somehow felt less brutal than sheltered valley bottoms, where cold air settled like water pooling in low ground. He'd observed that hillsides, despite appearing more exposed, often proved more survivable than the protected flats everyone preferred. Other trappers passing through over the next week stopped to offer similar advice. John Morrison, who'd built 4 cabins in his decade of mountain life, tried to explain basic site selection. You want wind protection, water access, and level ground. That hillside gives you none of those things. Henrik listened politely to each critique. He nodded, thanked them for their concern, and continued his preparations. His refusal to accept obvious wisdom convinced the trapping community that whatever sense Henrik had possessed was gone. Men began referring to his future home as Larson's Folly, or the Hillside Mistake. The site selection violated every principle of frontier construction. Cabins belonged in valleys, near water, on flat ground surrounded by timber. Henrik's chosen location was elevated, distant from water, sloped at 15 degrees, and surrounded by sparse forest that would require long hauls for firewood. By conventional standards, he was guaranteeing himself unnecessary hardship. What the other trappers couldn't see was Henrik's different framework for evaluating locations. He wasn't thinking about convenience. He was thinking about thermal dynamics he didn't have words to explain. He'd noticed that hillsides offered something valleys couldn't provide, something he intended to exploit in ways that would seem insane until winter proved him right. By mid-September, Henrik had marked out his building site on the slope. The mockery continued, but Henrik had stopped listening. He had work to do. Henrik began excavating into the hillside instead of clearing the slope's surface. He dug a semicircular trench 9 feet wide and 12 feet deep, carving directly into earth that other men considered unstable and dangerous. The work was brutal. Mountain soil at that elevation consisted of clay mixed with rocks and root systems that required chopping with a mattock before shoveling. Henrik worked alone, removing hundreds of pounds of earth daily. Thomas Webb discovered the excavation during his weekly trapline rounds and stopped his horse at the edge of Henrik's pit. The Swede stood waist-deep in his trench, sweating, despite the cool September air methodically cutting into the hillside's interior. Webb stared at the scene, trying to comprehend what he was witnessing. "What are you doing?" Webb finally asked, though the question sounded more like an accusation. Henrik paused his digging and looked up. "I make space for my home." "You're digging into the hill?" Webb's voice rose with incredulity. "You're supposed to build on top of the ground, not burrow under it like an animal." Henrik wiped sweat from his forehead and gestured at his excavation. "The earth here stays warm in winter, warmer than air. I build inside the warm earth, not on top of the cold ground." Webb shook his head slowly. "You're building a cave, a badger den." He turned his horse, calling back over his shoulder. "When that hillside collapses on you, don't expect anyone to dig out your corpse." The badger den nickname spread through the trapping community within days. Men who hadn't yet seen Henrik's project heard about the crazy Swede digging into a mountain like a mining prospector who'd lost his claim. Those who did visit came away convinced Henrik had suffered some kind of mental breakdown. Grown men didn't dig into hillsides. They cut timber and built above ground where structures could breathe and shed water. Henrik's excavation violated fundamental assumptions about shelter construction. Buildings stood on the earth's surface. They used the ground as a foundation, not as a surrounding environment. Digging into hillsides was what you did for root cellars or temporary dugouts, not permanent homes. The structural instability alone seemed obviously dangerous. One heavy rain could cause collapse. One freeze-thaw cycle could shift the earth and crush whatever stood inside. But Henrik continued digging through September and into October. His semicircular trench gradually deepened and widened, following a precise curved pattern he'd marked with stakes and string. The back wall of his excavation curved smoothly, showing careful attention to maintaining consistent arc geometry. The floor sloped slightly toward the entrance for drainage. By mid-October, Henrik had removed roughly 12 cubic yards of earth, creating a hollow in the hillside that resembled an amphitheater carved by water erosion. Neighbors passing by no longer offered advice. They simply stared, shook their heads, and rode on, convinced they were watching a man's slow descent into frontier madness. Inside his excavated hollow, Henrik laid a foundation of flat stones gathered from the creek bed 200 yards downslope. Each stone was selected for size and shape, then hauled uphill in a canvas pack that left his shoulders raw. The work required 3 weeks of daily trips, moving hundreds of individual stones that together weighed over a ton. Other trappers who witnessed this labor assumed Henrik was delaying the inevitable admission that his entire project was doomed. Foundation work in mountain cabin construction was considered unnecessary luxury. The standard approach was simple: fell trees, drag logs to the building site, notch the corners, and start stacking. The logs sat directly on earth. They'd rot eventually where they contacted soil, but that took years, and most trappers expected to move locations before rot became serious. Spending weeks building a stone foundation made no economic or practical sense. Thomas Webb stopped by in mid-October and found Henrik arranging stones in careful semicircular courses that matched his excavation's curved wall. The stones were laid without mortar, fitted together like puzzle pieces, creating a base that followed the arc Henrik had carved into the hillside. "You're building a foundation for a badger den," Webb observed, his tone mixing amusement with pity. "Henrik, you're putting more work into the base than most men put into entire cabins." Henrik placed another stone, testing its stability before accepting the placement. "Water must drain away from where I live. Stones give level surface and keep wood from touching wet earth." Webb dismounted and examined the stonework more closely. The craftsmanship was undeniably good. Each stone was properly seated, the courses were level, and the overall pattern showed thoughtful planning. But the effort seemed tragically misdirected. "All this work for a hole in the ground," Webb muttered. "You could have built a proper cabin in the time you've wasted." Henrik didn't respond. He'd learned that explaining his reasoning only generated more mockery. The other trappers saw a man building an elaborate foundation for a structure that shouldn't exist in the first place. They couldn't understand that Henrik was creating drainage systems and thermal barriers. They didn't have concepts to recognize. The foundation took 2 full weeks to complete. When finished, it formed a perfect semicircular platform 8 feet wide and 10 feet deep, raised 4 inches above the excavation floor. The stones were tightly fitted, creating a stable base that wouldn't shift or settle. Gaps between stones were filled with smaller rocks, producing a solid surface that would support substantial weight. To the trapping community, the foundation represented conclusive proof that Henrik had lost perspective. He'd spent 5 weeks creating an elaborate base for a home that violated every principle of frontier construction. The time investment alone guaranteed he'd struggle to complete adequate shelter before winter arrived in full force. Most men gave him until November before he'd be forced to abandon his project and seek shelter elsewhere, probably begging space in someone's conventional cabin while his hillside hole filled with snow. Henrik constructed a wooden frame shaped like a half-circle, using bent saplings and cross braces. Young willow trees growing near the creek provided the flexibility he needed. He cut poles roughly 2 inches in diameter, then heated them over his fire until the wood became pliable. While hot, he bent each pole into a curved arch and secured it in position until it cooled and held its shape. The process took days, producing a dozen arched ribs that formed the skeleton of his structure. Once the frame was complete, Henrik began attaching his precious corrugated metal sheets. The panels, originally flat industrial salvage, were flexible enough to conform to curved shapes when properly supported. He worked methodically, drilling holes through the metal using a hand auger. then securing each sheet to the wooden framework with iron bolts he'd carried from the trading post. Each panel overlapped the previous one by 6 inches, creating a layered shell that shed water like roof shingles. The work was technically demanding. Metal this thin could buckle if improperly supported. The curve had to maintain consistent radius to prevent stress points. Henrik spent a full week just on the first 2 panels, ensuring they were correctly positioned before proceeding. By late October, the metal shell began taking recognizable form and, passing trappers, finally understood what Henrik was building. It looked absurd. The structure resembled an overturned metal trough, a half-cylinder of corrugated iron sitting in a hillside excavation. The visual effect was jarring. Industrial materials in wilderness setting, curved metal where squared logs belonged. John Morrison stopped by during the metal installation and simply stared for several minutes before speaking. "That's your cabin?" Morrison finally asked. "A metal tube buried in dirt?" Henrik tightened a bolt and moved to the next attachment point. "Metal keeps weather out. Earth keeps cold out. Together they work." Morrison walked around the structure, examining it from different angles. "Metal conducts cold, Henrik. Everyone knows that. Touch a metal pan in winter. It freezes your hand instantly. You've built yourself a metal box that'll suck heat out faster than you can generate it." He shook his head. "I've seen some foolish construction in my time, but this surpasses everything." Other trappers who visited offered similar assessments. The metal would make the interior colder, not warmer. The curved shape offered no flat walls for bunks or storage. The entire design was backward, using expensive materials to create something worse than the simplest log cabin. Metal belonged in tools and equipment, not housing. Wood was the proper building material because it insulated, breathed, and provided structural strength without conducting temperature extremes. Henrik continued working through their criticisms. By early November, all 4 metal panels were attached, creating a complete semicircular shell 9 feet wide, 12 feet long, and 6 feet tall at the center peak. The structure was weather-tight, shedding the November rain that began falling as he completed the exterior. From the front, it looked like a metal cave mouth. From behind, it disappeared into the hillside completely. The trapping community's consensus was unanimous. Henrik Larsson had wasted a year's income building the most impractical shelter anyone had ever seen. Rather than mounting his door flush with the front edge of the metal structure, Henrik recessed it 3 feet back from the entrance. He built a wooden frame that extended into the hillside excavation, creating a small vestibule before the actual door. The vestibule floor was the same stone foundation he'd laid earlier, and the walls were vertical wooden planks anchored into the surrounding earth. A small roof section extended over this entry space, supported by 2 posts that formed a covered porch area. The door itself was solid construction, built from thick planks Henrik had laboriously sawn from logs using a pit saw. Each plank was fitted tightly against its neighbors, and the entire assembly was reinforced with diagonal bracing on the interior face. Heavy iron hinges, purchased at significant cost from the trading post, were mortised into both door and frame for maximum strength. A wooden bar lock on the interior would secure the door against wind or intruders. Thomas Webb arrived while Henrik was hanging the door and immediately noticed the recessed placement. "Why is your door set back like that?" he asked, gesturing at the vestibule space. "You've just made your cabin smaller for no reason." Henrik tested the door's swing, making minor adjustments to the hinges. The space before the door stops cold wind. Cold air falls down and stays in this outside room. When I open door, cold does not rush inside where I sleep. Webb stepped into the vestibule and looked around the small space. It was perhaps 4 feet deep and 5 feet wide, essentially a closet-sized room with no purpose he could identify. "Henrik, a door is supposed to keep cold out. That's what doors do. You don't need a whole extra room in front of your door. You just need a solid door." The recessed entry became another source of ridicule. Trappers who visited couldn't understand why anyone would sacrifice interior space to create an entrance tunnel. The concept made no practical sense. Doors worked perfectly well when mounted at the front of structures. Adding a vestibule was the kind of architectural flourish you might see on a wealthy merchant's townhouse, not a mountain trapper's shelter. It was overcomplication of a simple element, wasted space in an already questionable design. John Morrison offered his assessment during a visit in mid-November. You've got a tiny cabin made even smaller by a pointless entry room. Henrik, when winter comes and you're cramped inside that metal tube, you're going to regret every foot of space you gave away. Henrik finished installing his door and tested the bar lock mechanism. Everything functioned smoothly. The vestibule, despite the mockery, was exactly what he'd planned. It created an air pocket between exterior environment and interior living space. Cold air would settle into the vestibule rather than directly attacking his door. When he opened the door from inside, he'd step into a buffer zone rather than straight into winter weather. But explaining thermodynamics to men who built by tradition was impossible. They saw wasted space. Henrik saw thermal engineering. The gap between those perspectives was too wide to bridge with words, so Henrik stopped trying. His structure would speak for itself when winter arrived. Once the metal shell was complete, Henrik began the most baffling phase of his project. He packed earth against the metal walls, building up soil around the entire curved structure except for the front face. The work was the reverse of his initial excavation. Now he hauled earth from surrounding areas and carefully placed it against the metal shell, building up layers that gradually covered the curved surface. Each layer was tamped down firmly before adding the next, creating a solid earth mass that eventually rose to the peak of the metal arch. The labor required was staggering. Henrik estimated he moved roughly 15 cubic yards of earth during the berming process, all of it hauled in canvas sacks or wooden boxes, all of it placed by hand and carefully compacted. November weather turned cold and wet, making the work miserable. His hands cracked and bled from constant contact with cold soil. His back ached from the repetitive lifting and carrying, yet he continued methodically, adding inches of earth coverage daily. By late November, the structure had transformed completely. From the front, it looked like a metal face set into a grass-covered mound. The curved metal shell was entirely buried under 2 to 3 feet of earth. From behind and above, nothing artificial was visible at all. The structure had disappeared into the hillside, becoming part of the landscape rather than an object placed upon it. Only the recessed entryway and the small stovepipe protruding from the earth-covered roof indicated human construction. Thomas Webb visited during the final stages of berming and stood speechless for several minutes. Finally, he found words. "You're burying it. You spent months building that metal shelter, and now you're covering it with dirt." His voice carried a tone of sad resignation, as though watching someone destroy their own work was too tragic for anger. Henrik paused, his earth moving, and leaned on his shovel. "The earth protects the metal, keeps wind away, keeps heat inside." Webb shook his head slowly. "Henrik, you've literally buried your mistake instead of admitting it was wrong and starting over. This is the saddest thing I've seen in 10 years of mountain life." Other trappers who passed by during November shared Webb's assessment. The consensus was clear. Henrik had realized his metal shell was inadequate, but was too proud to admit failure. Rather than abandon the structure and build conventionally, he was trying to salvage it by covering it with earth. The result was neither proper cabin nor proper dugout, just an expensive mess that would likely collapse during the first heavy snow or spring thaw. John Morrison stopped by in early December as Henrik finished the final earth covering. "I hope you have somewhere else to winter," Morrison said quietly, "because that earth is going to freeze solid, and when it thaws in spring, it's going to slide right off that metal and probably take the whole structure down with it." Henrik thanked him for the concern and continued his work. The berming was nearly complete. His structure was as ready as he could make it. December had arrived, and he needed to move his supplies inside before serious winter began. Henrik installed a small cast-iron stove, the sort normally used for cooking rather than heating. The stove measured roughly 18 inches wide and 24 inches deep, with a firebox that could hold perhaps 4 pieces of split wood at a time. Most mountain cabins required massive fireplaces or large heating stoves that consumed enormous quantities of fuel. Henrik's heating stove was perhaps a quarter the size of standard equipment, completely inadequate by conventional wisdom for heating any space during Rocky Mountain winters. He positioned the stove in the back corner of his shelter, opposite the entrance. A stovepipe extended upward through the earth-covered roof, protruding just far enough above the surface to provide draft and prevent downdrafts during storms. The installation was competent, properly sealed, where the pipe penetrated the metal shell and earth covering. But the stove itself seemed comically undersized for the task it faced. Thomas Webb witnessed the stove installation during a December visit and laughed outright. "That's a cook stove, Henrik. You can't heat a cabin with that." "Little thing." Henrik arranged his firewood supply near the stove, stacking split pieces in neat rows. "I do not need big fire. Small fire is enough." Webb gestured at the metal walls, the earth-covered structure, the entire questionable design. "You're in a metal box buried in frozen ground. You'll need a roaring fire just to keep from freezing, and that toy stove won't come close to providing it." He paused, his expression shifting from amusement to genuine concern. "Henrik, you're going to die in here if you rely on that stove. Please, come winter at my cabin. I've got space, and I won't charge you anything. Just don't try to survive in this place." Other trappers who saw Henrik's heating arrangement offered similar warnings. John Morrison calculated that Henrik would need to burn at least half a cord of wood per week to maintain survivable temperatures, but the small stove couldn't handle that volume. The firebox was too small for the large pieces that burned longest. The stove's heat output was designed for cooking, not space heating. By every practical measure, Henrik's heating system was fatally inadequate. Henrik finished moving his supplies into the shelter in mid-December. He had dried food, coffee, ammunition, trapping equipment, and personal items stored on shelves he'd built along the curved interior walls. His bedding occupied a raised platform in one corner, keeping him off the cold floor. The interior space was cramped but organized, everything positioned for winter efficiency. On December 18, 1841, Henrik moved into his earth-sheltered structure full-time. He lit his small stove, closed his recessed door, and settled in for his first night. Outside, December cold was already dropping temperatures below zero. Inside, Henrik sat beside his tiny fire and waited to see if his calculations were correct. Trappers throughout the territory assumed this would be Henrik's last mistake. Most gave him until January before he'd be forced to abandon his buried metal shelter and seek real protection. Some wondered if he'd survive long enough to admit his error. The general consensus was sympathetic but certain. Henrik Larsson had built something that couldn't possibly work, and winter would prove it definitively within weeks. Henrik disappeared into his structure as winter settled into the mountains. Smoke from his small stovepipe appeared daily, thin and intermittent, compared to the constant, heavy smoke pouring from traditional cabin chimneys throughout the territory. Trappers occasionally passed his location during their rounds, checking trap lines or traveling between locations. They noticed his woodpile wasn't shrinking at the rate it should. Traditional cabins burned through a cord of wood monthly during deep winter. Henrik seemed to be using a fraction of that amount. Thomas Webb passed Henrik's site in early January and stopped to examine the structure from a distance. Smoke rose from the stovepipe in a thin line, barely visible against the gray winter sky. Snow covered the earth-bermed roof, making the structure nearly invisible except for the recessed entryway and the smoke. Webb calculated the wood consumption based on the pile size he'd seen in December versus what remained now. Henrik was burning perhaps 1/10 the fuel Webb used in his own cabin. Webb assumed Henrik was freezing and simply too stubborn to admit it. Perhaps the Swede was spending most of his time out on trap lines, staying warmer through activity than sitting in his metal tomb. Or perhaps he was rationing his firewood because he'd underestimated how much he'd need and was now trying to make insufficient supplies last until spring. Other trappers shared similar theories. John Morrison speculated that Henrik might be supplementing heat by sleeping in heavy furs and tolerating near-freezing interior temperatures. Another trapper suggested Henrik had abandoned the structure but was maintaining minimal fire to prevent his supplies from freezing solid. No one could explain the low fuel consumption in terms that suggested the shelter was actually working as intended. January brought sustained cold, temperatures dropping below zero and staying there for days at a time. Traditional cabins became siege environments. Trappers burned massive fires around the clock, yet still watched frost form on interior walls far from the fireplace. The gaps between logs conducted cold despite chinking. Doors leaked freezing air around their edges. Windows, even when covered with hides or shutters, transferred cold through their relatively thin coverings. Webb burned 4 cords of wood in January alone, more than he'd burned in any previous winter month. His cabin stayed marginally livable, temperatures hovering in the low 20s inside when fires were maintained constantly. Let the fire die for more than 2 hours, and interior temperature would plummet to near exterior levels within a short time. Yet Henrik's thin smoke continued rising daily from his hillside. He was clearly alive, clearly maintaining some kind of fire, but not burning anywhere near the fuel that should be required. The mystery deepened as January ended and February began. Henrik occasionally appeared on his trap lines, checking sets and collecting pelts. He looked healthy, not gaunt or frostbitten. His clothing wasn't the desperate layering of someone barely surviving cold. He seemed comfortable, which made no sense whatsoever. Webb stopped Henrik one morning in late January along a creek both men trapped. "How are you surviving in that place?" Webb asked directly. "You're not burning enough wood to heat anything." Henrik adjusted the beaver pelts in his pack. "I am warm enough. The earth keeps much cold away." Webb wanted to press further, but Henrik moved on to his next trap set. The Swede wasn't offering explanations, and Webb wasn't ready to admit enough curiosity to actually visit the structure and investigate personally. Thomas. Webb faced disaster when his cabin's chimney developed a crack during a February storm. The stone chimney had been built 3 years earlier, using rocks mortared with clay. The mortar had weakened over multiple freeze-thaw cycles, and the intense cold of 1842's winter finally caused a critical failure. A fist-sized stone loosened and shifted during the night of February 9th, creating a gap in the chimney structure about 4 feet above the fireplace. Smoke immediately began pouring into Webb's cabin rather than venting upward. He woke, choking, threw open his door to clear the air, and watched helplessly as his fire filled the interior with thick smoke. The temperature outside was 15 degrees below zero. Without fire, his cabin would become uninhabitable within hours. With fire, the smoke would suffocate him. He had no good options. Webb tried to patch the chimney gap from inside using mud and rags, but the heat from the fire prevented him from working close enough to make effective repairs. The stone that had shifted was part of the structural chimney wall, and without proper repointing from the exterior, the gap wouldn't seal. Exterior work during a storm at 15 below was nearly impossible and certainly dangerous. His nearest conventional neighbor was John Morrison, 4 miles distant through snow-covered terrain. Henrik's buried shelter was half a mile away. Webb had mocked Henrik's construction for 5 months. He'd called it a badger den, predicted its failure, and advised Henrik to abandon it. Now Webb needed help, and the closest source was the man he'd ridiculed most consistently. Swallowing his pride, Webb packed a small emergency kit and trudged through knee-deep snow toward Henrik's hillside. The storm was intensifying, wind driving snow horizontally across the landscape. Visibility dropped to perhaps 50 yards. Webb navigated by landmarks he'd memorized during his years in the territory, moving slowly to avoid exhausting himself in the deep snow. He reached Henrik's location after roughly 30 minutes of difficult travel. The earth-bermed structure was nearly invisible under fresh snow accumulation. Only the recessed entryway, slightly protected from direct snowfall, indicated where the entrance stood. Webb approached and called out, his voice barely audible over the wind. "Henrik! It's Webb, I need help." No response came immediately. Webb called again, louder, beginning to worry that Henrik might not be inside or might not hear him over the storm. Then the recessed door opened, and warm air radiated from the dark vestibule beyond. Henrik appeared, backlit by interior lamplight, his expression showing concern but no surprise. "Come inside," Henrik said simply, stepping back to allow Webb entry. Webb moved into the vestibule and immediately noticed the temperature difference. The small recessed space wasn't warm exactly, but it wasn't the killing cold of outside either. The air felt still, protected from wind, perhaps 10 or 15 degrees warmer than exterior temperature. He paused, surprised by the noticeable change in just this small buffer space. Henrik gestured toward the interior door. "Come in where it is warmer. You can tell me what happened." Webb stepped through the interior door into Henrik's main living space, and his understanding of how buildings worked shattered completely. The interior was genuinely comfortable. Webb stopped just inside the door, his mind struggling to process what his body felt. The temperature wasn't merely tolerable, it was warm enough that Henrik wore only a wool shirt, no heavy coat, or layered furs. The small stove glowed with a modest fire, nothing like the roaring blazes Webb burned constantly in his own cabin. Yet the space felt warmer than Webb's cabin did, even with massive wood consumption. Webb stood motionless for several seconds, his snow-covered clothing beginning to drip as it encountered interior warmth. Henrik closed the door behind him and gestured toward a chair near the stove. "Sit, I make coffee. You tell me what brings you out in this storm." Webb moved mechanically to the chair, still trying to understand what he was experiencing. He removed his heavy coat, something he never did in his own cabin during winter. The air felt stable, not drafty. His breath didn't fog visibly, as it did in traditional cabins. He reached out tentatively and touched the metal wall. It was room temperature, not cold. Metal should conduct away heat, should feel freezing to the touch. This metal felt neutral, as though the cold outside didn't exist. Henrik prepared coffee using a pot on his small stove. Webb watched him move around the cramped space with easy familiarity. The interior was organized efficiently, shelves holding supplies, bedding neatly arranged on a raised platform, everything positioned for maximum utility in minimal space. A single oil lamp provided light. The stove provided heat. Nothing seemed excessive or wasteful. "My chimney cracked," Webb finally said, his voice sounding strange in his own ears. "Smoke filled my cabin. I can't stay there until I repair it, and I can't repair it during this storm." Henrik poured coffee into 2 tin cups and handed one to Webb. "You can stay here until storm passes. Then we fix your chimney together." Webb sipped the coffee, feeling warmth spread through his chest. He looked around the space again, trying to identify what made it work when everything about the design should have failed. The metal walls he'd assumed would conduct away heat weren't cold. The earth covering he'd thought would crush the structure or freeze solid was somehow providing protection. The tiny stove he'd considered inadequate was maintaining comfortable temperature with a fire that would barely warm a cooking pot in a traditional cabin. "How?" Webb asked simply. "How is this warm?" Henrik sat on his bed platform, cradling his own coffee. "The earth around us stays warm, not warm like summer, but warm compared to winter air. Maybe 50 degrees always, deep in the ground. I built inside that warm earth. The metal keeps weather out, but the earth keeps cold out. The little fire just adds small warmth to what earth already provides." Webb shook his head slowly. "That's impossible. Earth freezes in winter. Everyone knows that." "Surface freezes," Henrik agreed. "But deep earth, protected earth, stays same temperature. Always." He gestured at the walls around them. "We sit inside the earth now. The earth protects us." Henrik explained his design while Webb stayed through the blizzard. The conversation lasted hours. Henrik patient and methodical, Webb alternately skeptical and reluctantly convinced. The principles Henrik described contradicted everything Webb thought he understood about construction and survival. Earth 5 feet below surface stays roughly 50 degrees year-round, Henrik began. In summer, deep earth is cooler than air. In winter, deep earth is warmer than air. This is why root cellars work. Vegetables stay cold in summer, not frozen in winter. Same principle. Webb had built root cellars. The concept wasn't foreign, but he'd never considered applying underground temperature stability to living spaces. Root cellars are for storage, not living. "Why not living?" Henrik asked. "If Earth keeps temperature steady for vegetables, it keeps temperature steady for people. I built my home inside that steady temperature instead of on top of freezing air." The logic was simple once stated, but it challenged fundamental assumptions. Buildings sat on the ground, not in it. Humans lived above Earth, not surrounded by it. Henrik had violated those assumptions deliberately, and the result was undeniable comfort during conditions that made traditional cabins barely survivable. "The metal shell," Henrik continued, "is only weather protection. It stops rain, stops wind, keeps snow from touching the wood frame inside, but metal does not provide warmth. Earth provides warmth by preventing cold from reaching us." Webb studied the curved metal ceiling above them. Snow piled on the earth-covered roof, several feet of it, based on storm accumulation. Yet the interior felt no colder. The earth layer between metal shell and living space prevented exterior cold from penetrating. Traditional log walls, even well-chinked ones, conducted cold through the wood itself. Henrik's earth barrier was feet thick, an insulation mass no log wall could match. "Your recessed entry," Webb said, understanding dawning. "It's not decoration. It traps cold air." Henrik nodded. "Cold air is heavy. It falls. The vestibule catches falling cold, keeps it away from main door. When I open door from inside, I step into space that is already warmer than outside. Less heat escapes." Webb had mocked that recessed entry for months, considered it wasted space and pointless complication. Now he recognized it as deliberate engineering, creating a thermal buffer that traditional cabins lacked. Every time Webb opened his cabin door, exterior cold rushed directly inside. Henrik's design staged the temperature transition, protecting his interior warmth through simple physics. "The small stove works," Henrik explained, "because I only need to add small heat. The earth already provides most protection. In traditional cabin, you fight constantly against cold coming through walls. Here, earth does most of the fighting. Stove just maintains comfort." Webb sat quietly, processing implications that extended far beyond Henrik's personal shelter. If this design worked, and he was sitting inside proof that it did, then every cabin Webb had ever built was fundamentally flawed. Traditional construction fought nature through brute force, burning massive fuel to overwhelm cold penetration. Henrik's approach worked with nature, using Earth's constant temperature as primary insulation and adding minimal heat to achieve comfort. "Why didn't you explain this months ago?" Webb asked. "When everyone was mocking you?" Henrik smiled slightly. "Would you have believed me? Would anyone? Words cannot teach this. Only experience teaches. You believe now because you feel it working." The blizzard that brought Webb to Henrik's shelter was merely the opening act. February 12, 1842, brought temperatures that would become legendary in trapping community memory. The storm cleared during the night, and radiational cooling under cloudless skies dropped temperatures catastrophically. By dawn, thermometers read 43 degrees below zero, the coldest measurement anyone in the territory had recorded. Traditional cabins became death traps. Webb's cabin, even if his chimney had been functional, would have struggled to maintain survivable interior temperature. John Morrison's cabin, built to standard specifications with good chinking and a massive stone fireplace, dropped to 5 degrees above zero inside despite burning wood as fast as he could feed it. Frost formed on interior walls 3 inches thick. Water froze solid in buckets placed beside roaring fires. Breathing hurt. Movement required enormous effort, as every action drained heat from already hypothermic bodies. 3 trappers abandoned their cabins entirely when fires consumed fuel faster than they could replenish it. William Hayes tried to maintain his cabin's warmth, but exhausted his wood supply by mid-morning and was forced to begin burning furniture and interior fixtures. By afternoon, he was burning his bed frame, huddling beside the fire, wearing every piece of clothing he owned, watching his breath freeze in the air despite flames 3 feet away. Hayes lasted until evening before accepting he would die if he stayed. He wrapped himself in blankets, abandoned his cabin, and staggered toward the nearest neighbor, arriving half-frozen and barely coherent. 2 other trappers made similar desperate journeys, seeking shared warmth in combined shelters where multiple men and combined fires might maintain survival temperatures. News spread through the scattered community as men moved between locations seeking help. The extreme cold was killing people. Trappers with decades of experience were facing conditions their cabins couldn't handle. Traditional construction, proven over generations, was failing against temperature extremes that exceeded design parameters. As dawn broke on February 13th, with temperatures still hovering near 40 below, desperate men began moving toward Henrik's location. Webb had survived the previous day comfortably in the earth-sheltered structure and had described the experience to Morrison during a brief meeting. The word spread. The crazy Swede's buried metal shelter was warm. Impossibly warm, warm enough that Henrik burned a tiny fire and wore shirt sleeves while the rest of the territory froze, despite massive fuel consumption. Men who'd mocked Henrik's construction for 5 months were now trudging through snow toward his hillside, hoping the madman's impossible invention might save their lives. 7 trappers appeared at Henrik's recessed entrance within hours of each other, their assumptions about shelter and survival shattered by cold their traditional cabins couldn't defeat. They came expecting to find Henrik frozen, or nearly so. Instead, they found warmth that seemed to violate physics itself. 7 trappers crowded into Henrik's earth-sheltered structure, their frosted beards melting in the impossible warmth. They came expecting marginal survival conditions, hoping even inadequate shelter might be better than their failing cabins. Instead, they found Henrik comfortable, his small stove burning a modest fire, interior temperature measuring roughly 25 degrees. Outside measured 43 below. The difference was 68 degrees. Henrik's shelter was maintaining interior warmth that exceeded exterior temperature by margins that seemed physically impossible. Thomas Webb made introductions as men arrived. John Morrison came first, followed by William Hayes, still wrapped in the blankets he'd used for his desperate journey. 3 younger trappers arrived together, having abandoned a shared cabin when their fire consumed their entire wood supply without maintaining livable temperature. The final arrival was an older French-Canadian named Jacques Moreau, a 15-year veteran who'd survived winter's web, considered legendary for their harshness. Moreau stood just inside the door for several minutes, saying nothing, his weathered face showing confusion that bordered on fear. Finally, he spoke in French-accented English. "This is not possible. I feel warmth, but it cannot be real." Henrik offered coffee to each arrival, moving calmly through his cramped space to accommodate 7 unexpected guests. The structure wasn't designed for this many occupants, but even crowded, it remained comfortable. The small stove continued its modest burn, requiring only occasional wood addition to maintain temperature. Men sat on the floor, on Henrik's bed platform, wherever space allowed, and simply absorbed the warmth that had seemed like fantasy hours earlier. Hayes examined the metal walls, touching them repeatedly as though expecting them to suddenly feel cold. Metal should freeze. Metal conducts. This makes no sense. Henrik explained patiently, repeating what he'd told Webb days earlier. The earth surrounding them maintained constant temperature. The metal shell was weather protection only. The earth itself provided insulation no log wall could match. The recessed entry trapped cold air before it reached the living space. The small stove added minimal heat to what Earth's thermal mass already provided. Morrison listened to the explanation with growing comprehension. He'd built enough root cellars to understand Earth's temperature stability, but applying that principle to living space had never occurred to him. Traditional wisdom said humans lived above ground in wooden structures. Henrik had questioned that wisdom and created something that worked better than tradition. "How much wood do you burn daily?" Morrison asked, already knowing the answer would be startling. Henrik gestured at his modest wood pile. "Perhaps 6 pieces this size." He indicated split wood, roughly 8 inches long and 3 inches diameter, sometimes less if day is not too cold. Morrison calculated mentally. 6 pieces of that size might equal 1/10 the wood he burned daily in his conventional cabin. Yet Henrik's interior was warmer than Morrison's had ever achieved despite massive fuel consumption. The efficiency wasn't merely better, it was revolutionary. Henrik had solved the fundamental problem of frontier winter survival not through harder work or more resources, but through understanding thermal principles that made traditional construction obsolete. Over the next 2 days, as extreme cold maintained its grip and 7 trappers sheltered in Henrik's structure, the education continued. Henrik wasn't a teacher by nature or training, but desperation made his guests attentive students. They asked detailed questions, examined every aspect of the construction, and gradually understood why something that looked insane actually represented sophisticated engineering. Earth 5 feet below surface maintains roughly 50 degrees regardless of season, Henrik explained again, establishing the foundation principle. This is physical law, not opinion. Dig deep enough anywhere. Temperature stabilizes. In winter, that stable temperature is much warmer than air. In summer, much cooler. Morrison asked about Earth penetration depth. How deep before you reach that stable temperature? Depends on location and season, Henrik said. But generally, below 4 or 5 feet, temperature changes very slow. My walls have 3 feet of earth between living space and outside air. That earth stays near 50 degrees even when air is 40 below. The men, those, mentally calculated the implication. A 3-foot thick wall maintaining 50-degree temperature created an insulation barrier of extraordinary effectiveness. Traditional log walls, even well-built ones, might be 8 to 12 inches thick and conducted cold through the wood itself. Henrik's earth barrier was 4 times thicker and consisted of material that didn't conduct temperature rapidly. "Why doesn't the earth freeze solid?" Hayes asked. "Ground freezes in winter. Surface freezes," Henrik clarified. Top foot or 2, depending on cold duration. But deeper earth stays warmer. Think about springs that flow all winter. Water comes from deep earth where it stays liquid. My shelter walls are protected by roof earth above and hillside earth behind. Cold cannot reach deep enough to freeze my walls. Webb understood the hillside selection now. Building into the slope surrounded the structure with earth that was already stable and protected. Flat ground construction would have required excavating deep enough to reach stable temperature. Far more work. The hillside provided that depth naturally. "The metal conducts heat away from inside," Moreau observed. "Why use metal at all?" Henrik tapped the curved metal ceiling. "Metal is weather shell only. Snow and rain stay outside, but between metal and living space there is wooden frame, then earth above. The metal never touches interior air. It only touches earth, which stays constant temperature. No conduction path exists from inside warmth to outside cold." The design's genius was in layering functions. Metal shed precipitation, wood provided structural framework, earth provided insulation. Each material did what it did best, and the combination created performance no single material could achieve alone. Morrison asked about the recessed entry. Henrik explained cold air's tendency to settle in low areas, creating natural stratification. The vestibule trapped the coldest air before it reached the main door, preventing it from entering the living space when the door opened. Traditional flush-mounted doors allowed exterior cold to rush directly inside with each opening. "You designed this entire system before building anything?" Morrison asked, respect clear in his tone. Henrik shook his head. "I observed what worked in nature and applied it. Badgers stay warm in dens. Roots survive frozen winters underground. Water flows unfrozen from springs. Nature showed the principles. I only copied them." As winter released its grip and March brought slowly rising temperatures, trappers who'd survived the extreme cold returned to their cabins with transformed understanding. Traditional construction had failed them catastrophically. Nearly everyone had experienced frozen nights despite burning enormous amounts of wood. Some had lost toes to frostbite. One man, living alone 15 miles from the nearest neighbor, had died when his fire went out during the coldest night, and he lacked strength to restart it. His body was found in April when the spring thaw allowed travel to remote locations. The death sobered the entire community. Mountain life had always been dangerous, but freezing to death inside supposedly adequate shelter represented failure of basic survival infrastructure. Men began questioning assumptions they'd never thought to challenge. If traditional cabin construction couldn't protect against extreme cold, what was the point of building traditionally? Henrik's shelter had protected 8 men during the crisis with minimal fuel consumption and genuine comfort. That fact spread through the territory as trappers gathered at trading posts and shared winter survival stories. The crazy Swede's buried metal shelter became the primary topic of conversation. Men who hadn't seen it demanded descriptions from those who had. Webb, Morrison, and the others who'd sheltered there became informal ambassadors for earth-sheltered construction principles. By April, trappers began visiting Henrik's location specifically to examine the structure and ask questions. Henrik welcomed everyone, explained his reasoning, and shared technical details freely. He had no interest in claiming credit or profiting from his innovation. He'd built the shelter to survive, and it had worked. If others could benefit from his experience, that seemed natural and appropriate. The first conversions began in May. John Morrison announced he would excavate a hillside site for his next winter shelter, incorporating earth berming even if he couldn't replicate Henrik's metal shell exactly. Thomas Webb planned to add earth berming to his existing cabin's north wall, where wind and cold penetrated most severely. 2 younger trappers formed a partnership to build a shared, earth-sheltered structure using techniques Henrik had demonstrated. By June, 4 trappers were actively excavating hillside sites. The work was slow and physically demanding, requiring entire summer months to complete. But the effort seemed worthwhile given winter's demonstration that traditional construction couldn't handle temperature extremes. Men who'd mocked Henrik's excavation work the previous year were now doing identical work themselves, digging into hillsides they'd previously considered unsuitable for construction. Not everyone converted. Some trappers remained skeptical, arguing that the previous winter represented unusual conditions unlikely to repeat. Others lacked the physical capability to do excavation work that Henrik had accomplished alone. A few considered the time investment too large, preferring to improve traditional designs rather than adopting radically different approaches. But enough men embraced earth-sheltering principles that the technique spread organically through the Northern Rockies trapping community. Each successful construction validated Henrik's approach further. Each winter that passed without freezing deaths in earth-sheltered structures reinforced the wisdom of thermal mass design. Earth-sheltered construction spread through the Northern Rockies over the following years, adapted and modified by different builders with varying resources and skills. Some trappers created full underground homes with only south-facing walls exposed, going beyond Henrik's partial earth berming to complete burial. Others built traditional cabins but added earth berms against north walls, where wind and cold penetrated most severely. A few attempted to replicate Henrik's metal shell technique, though metal remained expensive and difficult to acquire in frontier regions. The innovation wasn't the specific materials Henrik had used. Metal shells and corrugated panels were impractical for most trappers given cost and availability. The innovation was understanding that earth itself provided superior insulation compared to any wooden wall. Once that principle was grasped, builders adapted it using whatever materials they possessed. Log cabins built partially into hillsides became common. Structures with earth-packed roofs replaced traditional bark and pole construction. Recessed entries appeared on cabins throughout the territory as builders recognized the thermal airlock benefits. John Morrison built a hybrid structure in 1843 that combined traditional log construction with earth-sheltering principles. His cabin used horizontal logs for the south-facing wall, where light and access were important, but the north, east, and west walls were earth-bermed to shoulder height. The roof was heavily earth-covered with drainage channels to prevent water accumulation. A recessed entry protected the door. The result looked peculiar, half cabin and half mound, but it performed exceptionally well during the winter of 1843 through 44. Thomas Webb added earth berming to his existing cabin rather than building new. He excavated around his north wall and packed earth 3 feet deep against the logs, extending the berm to cover half his roof. The modification required 2 months of summer work, but the following winter showed dramatic improvement. His firewood consumption dropped by roughly half, and interior temperatures stayed noticeably more stable during cold snaps. By 1845, frontier guides specifically recommended hillside construction in extreme climates. Written accounts from the period mention earth-covered shelters and hillside homes as proven designs for mountain winters. The specific attribution to Henrik Larsson was largely lost as the technique spread and evolved, but the principles he demonstrated remained embedded in frontier building knowledge. The technique spread beyond the trapping community into early mining camps and isolated settlements. Prospectors arriving in Montana and Wyoming territories during the late 1840s discovered abandoned earth-sheltered structures and recognized their superiority for winter survival. Some were reoccupied and maintained. Others served as models for new construction. The architectural form became regionally significant, shaping how people built in high-altitude, extreme cold environments. Military frontier posts began incorporating earth berming for critical structures like powder magazines and food storage buildings, where temperature stability was essential. The principles Henrik had applied to personal survival proved valuable for institutional needs. Earth's insulation properties worked regardless of scale or purpose, protecting supplies and equipment as effectively as they protected humans. The ridicule that had followed Henrik's original project was forgotten entirely by 1846. Earth-sheltered design was simply accepted frontier practice in cold regions, one option among many, chosen based on site conditions and builder capabilities. Henrik Larsson left the mountains in 1853, returning to Minnesota where Swedish immigrant communities offered social connection his isolated trapping life had lacked. He was 38 years old, had accumulated modest savings from 12 years of successful trapping, and was ready for different challenges. He married in 1854, started a family, and established a small farm outside St. Paul. His children knew their father had once trapped beaver in the Rockies, but the details of his mountain life remained largely unshared. Henrik was a quiet man who preferred present work to past stories, but his earth-sheltered structure remained functional on that south-facing Montana slope. The metal shell weathered slowly, developing rust spots that didn't compromise structural integrity. The earth, berming, settled slightly but remained intact. The recessed entry stayed clear because the overhang prevented snow accumulation. The interior stayed dry because Henrik's drainage planning had been sound. The structure required no maintenance, yet continued performing its designed function years after Henrik departed. Prospectors discovered the shelter in 1862 during the Montana Gold Rush. 3 men traveling to newly discovered goldfields took refuge there during an early October snowstorm. They found the interior surprisingly comfortable, lit a fire in Henrik's original stove, and weathered the storm in warmth that seemed miraculous given the structure's age and apparent abandonment. They left messages scratched into the metal walls thanking the unknown builder. Over the following decades, the shelter served as a way station for travelers crossing that section of the territory. Hunters used it. Trappers who didn't know Henrik's name knew his shelter's location and reliability. Prospectors caught in mountain storms survived because they reached the earth-covered structure before hypothermia became fatal. The building became legendary in local knowledge, marked on informal maps as reliable emergency shelter. Modern historians estimate several dozen lives were saved directly because people found Henrik's shelter during crises. The exact number is impossible to determine because survival often goes unrecorded. People who reached safety simply continued their journeys without documenting how close they'd come to death. But accounts from the period include multiple references to the Hillside shelter or the metal cave that provided unexpected warmth during dangerous conditions. The phrase "warm as a hillside shelter" became regional idiom in some Montana communities, signifying unexpected protection or surprising effectiveness. The phrase's origin was forgotten as generations passed, but the sentiment remained embedded in local speech. Henrik Larsson died in 1876 at age 61 on his Minnesota farm, surrounded by family who mourned a father and husband, not a frontier innovator. His gravestone made no mention of mountains, metal, or earth-sheltered construction. His obituary noted his Swedish heritage, his successful farming operation, and his survivors. The trapping years were summarized in one sentence, acknowledging previous residents in Rocky Mountain territories. But in the mountains, his shelter stood another 40 years before finally collapsing when the wooden internal frame rotted beyond structural capacity. The metal shell rusted through. The earth berming slumped into the interior. By 1920, nothing remained visible except a depression in the hillside where Henrik had excavated 80 years earlier.